favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the yeas and
Gentleman
nays.
from Texas.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. vote. The yeas are 223. The nays are 191. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote on ordering the previous question on House Resolution 656, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Calendar Number 51, House Resolution 656. Resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 823 to provide for the designation of certain wilderness areas, recreation management areas, and conservation areas in the state of Colorado and for other purposes, providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 1373 to protect for current and future generations the watershed, ecosystem, and cultural heritage of the Grand Canyon region in the state of Arizona and for other purposes, providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 2181 to provide for the withdrawal and protection of certain federal land in the state of New Mexico, and providing for proceedings during the period from November 1st, 2019 through November 11th, 2019.
The question is on ordering the previous question. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
On this vote, the yeas are 222 and the nays are 181. The previous question is ordered. The question is on the adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The resolution is...
Mr. Speaker, I call for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring that vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number have risen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Members, this is a 5-minute vote. 5-minute vote.
Mr. Speaker, please join
Without objection, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to thank my dear friend and constituent, Rabbi Evan Hoffman, for giving the opening prayer today. Rabbi Hoffman has led Congregation Anshe Shalom in New Rochelle, New York, since 2012. He graduated Yeshiva College, summa cum laude, where he received ordination from Rabbi Isaac Elchanan's Theological Seminary. Rabbi Hoffman is an accomplished author, writing the weekly essay series titled Thoughts on the Parasha, as well as the editor of English language publications for Talmud Israeli. Rabbi Hoffman was raised in Great Neck, New York, and is an avid New York Mets fan. Rabbi Hoffman and his wife, Sari, are the proud parents of two wonderful children, Eliyahu and Alana. I want to thank my friend for the wonderful prayer this morning. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair will entertain up to 15 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to applaud the House approval of the Veteran Treatment Court Coordination Act legislation led by Congressman Charlie Crist, which I am a proud co-sponsor, directing grants, training, and assistance for communities to establish and operate veteran treatment courts. In 2008, Buffalo City Court Judge Robert Russell established the very first veteran treatment court in the nation. Today, there are over 400 such courts. These specialized courts provide veterans, many battling substance abuse or post-traumatic stress disorder, with a tactical path to avoid jail and take command of their future. At their side are fellow veterans, also known as battle buddies, who serve as volunteer mentors, as well as judges and professional staff who can connect these warriors with Veterans Administration benefits. Support for the Veterans Treatment Courts allows the nation to give veterans what they have given us, freedom and peace. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Congratulations to President Donald Trump for receiving the Bipartisan Justice Award for his historic success on criminal justice reform at Columbia's Benedict College. This is another example of President Trump promises made, promises kept, accomplishing what former administrations have failed to achieve, also proving the importance of doing what's right and focusing on issues truly affecting the American people. It is always exciting for South Carolinians when President Trump visits. My wife Roxanne and I were grateful to welcome President Trump at the Columbia Airport at Springdale with Governor Henry McMaster and First Lady Peggy McMaster, Lieutenant Governor Pamela Evett and her husband David, with Senator Tim Scott. The President was warmly welcomed. I am grateful for Benedict College President Rosalind Clark Artis for her dedicated service. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we will never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition?
I extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, in Rhode Island and across the country, the manufacturing industry employs Americans in high-paying, high-skilled jobs while driving innovation and bolstering our national defense. Unfortunately, manufacturers in my home state have informed me that they can't find enough qualified candidates to fill job openings, and their current workforce is aging. And this is something that is facing manufacturers I know across the country. To address this challenge, I've been a strong advocate for career and technical education. And yesterday, I introduced the Retain Innovation and Manufacturing Excellence Act. This bill, which is a companion to my good friend Senator Sheldon Whitehouse's bill in the Senate, will help manufacturers train new workers by providing funds to retain retiring employees long enough to train their replacements. Our nation's manufacturers are a cornerstone of our economy, and I'm proud to introduce this bill during Manufacturing Month to build the next generation of skilled workers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask 1 minute to unanimously address the House for 1 minute without objection.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize the Mennonite Club of Jacksonville, Florida, which is celebrating 100 years of service and camaraderie with
to the historical facts. It is a good common sense measure with broad bipartisan support. I want to thank Mr. Schiff, the resolution's author, as well as Ms. Eshu, Ms. Spear, Ms. Shalala, Mr. McGovern, Mr. Pallone, Mr. Bilirakis, Mr. Smith, and the many other bipartisan champions of this issue for their persistent, steadfast pursuit of recognition for the suffering the Armenian people endured. I strongly support this measure and urge all my colleagues to do the same. With its passage, we put Congress on the right side of history, properly acknowledging and condemning this horrific genocide. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, when the term genocide was created in 1944 to describe the systematic destruction of an entire people, its author, Raphael Lemkin, explained the term by saying, quote, "It's the sort of thing Hitler did to the Jews and the Turks did to the Armenians." When he ordered the invasion of Poland in 1939, Adolf Hitler said, quote, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians," close quote. Mr. Speaker, in the year 2000 and again in the year 2015, I chaired 2 congressional hearings on the Armenian genocide. In 2000, the House was moving to pass a bipartisan resolution by Congressman Radonovich and Bonnier, H.Res. 398. After hearing fact-based, eloquent testimonies from Congressman James Rogan and David Bonnier, followed by the State Department, history professors, and then witnesses from both the Armenian and the Turkish side, my subcommittee successfully marked up H.Res. 398 for consideration by the full committee. Ambassador Mark Grossman, however, testified at the hearing that President Bill Clinton was against the Armenian Genocide Resolution. That opposition proved to be very significant, and as we were moving with the highest expectations towards its passage, President Clinton's National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, took the extraordinary step of admonishing Speaker Hastert not to bring it to the floor, and he caved. The resolution never even got a vote. In 2007, Chairman Tom Lantos, like Chairman Henry Hyde before him, reported the resolution out of committee, sponsored by Congressman Schiff and Radonovich, although it never got out of the committee in 2000, but he wanted to. And that was H.Res. 106. That, too, never made it to the floor. That, Mr. Speaker, changes today. The affirming the United States record on the Armenian genocide, H.Res. 296, is a sense of Congress resolution that commemorates the Armenian genocide through official recognition and remembrance. The resolution wisely notes that the United States has officially recognized the Armenian genocide through the U.S. government's May 1951 written statement to the International Court of Justice regarding the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, through President Ronald Reagan's proclamation number 4838 on April 22, 1981, and by House Joint Resolution 148, adopted in 1975, and House Joint Resolution 247, adopted in September of 1984. The resolution also points out that the U.S. played a major role, the role, in the humanitarian relief efforts. And of course, the Near East Relief Agency saved tens of thousands of Armenians and others. As a matter of fact, the historian Howard Sakar noted it quite literally kept an entire nation alive, and that's reflected in the resolution. Yet today, the Armenian genocide is the only genocide of the 20th century where survivors, family, and all those who care about this important issue have been subjected to the ongoing outrage of a massive, well-funded, aggressive campaign of genocide denial, openly sustained and lavishly funded by the state authority, in this case, the government of Turkey. And the Turkish government underwrites a disgraceful disinformation campaign to confuse the historical record. It often employs lobbyists in this town to carry that message forward. My 2015 hearing, Mr. Speaker, marked the 100th year since the beginning of the genocide, and I appropriately entitled it A Century of Denial, the Armenian Genocide and the Ongoing Quest for Justice. As Pope Francis said at his Mass marking the 100th year of genocide, concealing or denying evil is like allowing a wound to keep bleeding without bandaging it. The facts of the genocide were reported, Mr. Speaker, throughout the world as they were happening, corroborated immediately afterward by survivors and even some of the perpetrators, and have been amply documented by historians. And in one particular book that I've read by Ambassador Morgenthau, who was our U.S. ambassador contemporaneously at the time to the Ottoman Empire. In 1915, as we know, there were about 2 million Armenians living in what was then the Ottoman Empire, now Turkey. They were living in a region that they had inhabited for 2,500 years or more. By 1923, however, over 90% of these Armenians had disappeared. Most of them, an estimated 1.5 million, were slaughtered. Most of them were death marched into the desert or shot, and many of the women were raped. The remainder, the remnant, was forced into exile. U.S. Ambassador Morgenthau wrote, when the Turkish authorities gave orders for these deportations, they were merely giving a death warrant to a whole race. They understood this well, and their conversations with me, they made no particular attempt to conceal that fact, close quote. The Encyclopedia for the Armenian Genocide states, during the march, many Armenians were killed indiscriminately by Ottoman forces, which left a trail of corpses along the route of the march. To break the will of the marchers, the killings were performed with swords, resulting in great bloodshed. And as they continued the march, they were marched into the Syrian desert, where they died from starvation. At the Center of Holocaust and Human Rights and Genocide Education exhibit at Brookdale Community College, which my good friend and colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, knows so well as well, they have many remembrances of people in our state and elsewhere who were survivors. Well, one of those survivors put it this way, and I quote her, "Life was a matter of trying to survive. Every morning a cart would come around and take away the sick and the dead to be dumped into a common grave. They had taken my brother because he was a little sick. My crying and weeping were of no avail, especially because I was sick and petrified of being put on the cart." She was one of the lucky ones who survived. Let me remind my colleagues that the Genocide Convention of 1950, which the Turkish government has ratified, makes clear. Here's what the Genocide Convention says, and the Armenian genocide fits this to a T. The definition says this: genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of that group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. In the case of the Armenians, it wasn't in part, it was in whole. They wanted the Armenians eviscerated from the face of the earth. Let me just point out to my colleagues, despite Turkish government threats, and they do make threats, am I hearing the ambassador made threats in the year 2000? In fact, you remember that. It was outrageous. Well, 28 countries in 49 U.S. states, including my own state of New Jersey, have passed a law, resolution, or declaration recognizing the Armenian genocide. So again, I reserve the balance of my time, but I ask members to support this resolution. It's bipartisan, and it needs to be done.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the Majority Leader, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Without objection.
I thank the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, the chairman of the committee, for yielding. And I thank Mr. Smith for his career-long advocacy of human rights and protecting the most vulnerable, not only in this country, but throughout the world. Mr. Smith and I have had the opportunity to travel behind the Iron Curtain when it existed, talking about human rights, talking about the right to emigrate, the right to worship, the right to freedom of speech. Talked about the Helsinki Final Act. He and I were both members of the Helsinki Commission for a couple of decades together. He and I have worked in Turkey together, talking about particularly the freedom of the press and how many members, how many journalists were imprisoned. Mr. Smith and I, and Mr. Engel and I, and so many others, and certainly Mr. Schiff and others, have been supporters of this resolution for a very long time. It has not come to the floor. one of my duties as majority leader is to bring bills to the floor, and I am proud, along with the chairman and the ranking member, to bring this bill to the floor. This resolution, Mr. Speaker, recognizes the horrific and systematic efforts to commit genocide against the Armenian people a century ago. There can be no denial of the Armenian genocide, which is evidenced by historical documentation and the emotional scars still borne by the descendants of its survivors. It was a campaign of ethnic cleansing committed by the Ottoman Empire during and after the First World War, and it led to the deaths of 1.5 million Armenians, alongside other targeted groups. Now, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Smith referenced Ambassador Morgenthau, who was our ambassador at this period of time. He said this: when the Turkish authorities gave the orders for these deportations, they were merely giving the death warrant to a whole race. They understood this well, and in their conversations with me, they made no particular attempt to conceal the fact. He went on to say that I am confident that the whole history of the human race contains no such horrible episode as this. Of course, we were tragically to see an even greater Holocaust in terms of numbers of lives lost in just some 30 years later. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the British ambassador to the United States in an October 1915 speech said this: the massacres are the result of a policy which, as far as I can ascertain, has been entertained for some considerable time. And I want to read this language. Considered for some considerable time by the gang of unscrupulous adventurers who are now in possession of the government of the Turkish Empire. They hesitated to put it in practice until they thought the favorable moment had come. And that moment seems to have arrived about the month of April. Now, the reason I bring that up is this resolution is not anti the present Turkish government. The sanctions bill will stand for that. This is about something that happened historically, that if not recognized, may well happen again. When you say never again, you must recognize what the never again is. I have talked to Turkish ambassadors and others for over a quarter of a century as a member of the Congress of the United States, and said to them, this is not about your government. This is about, as the British ambassador says, a gang of thugs who took over your government over 100 years ago. I regret that our Turkish friends have not recognized this as our German friends have recognized their genocide and said this was wrong. Because if they tell their people this is wrong, it is more likely that it will not be repeated. Mr. Speaker, as the House joins in condemnation of that genocide and memorializes its victims, let us also keep our attention focused on populations today that are being subjected to ethnic cleansing and forced relocation. From the Rohingya to the Uyghurs, from the people in Darfur to the Kurdish population being forced from their homes in Syria, as we speak, we must declare loudly and clearly, never again. Never again. Sadly, never is now. In particular, our Kurdish allies who fought so courageously to help us defeat ISIS are being forced to leave their homes by Turkey's campaign to seize control of northern Syria. Let today's action in this House be a reminder, Mr. Speaker, to President Erdogan and his government. The United States is watching. The American people will not turn our eyes away. Neither will we turn our eyes away from the millions of others in Syria who have been displaced and the hundreds of thousands who have been killed, who have been bombed, gassed, and brutalized by the Assad regime and its enablers. That is why it's important to recognize the genocide perpetrated against the Armenian people, so that we will recognize other such actions which, because of their race or their color or their ethnicity or some other distinction, subject them to mass murder. Mr. Speaker, we need to let the American people's representatives give clear message to our Armenian brothers and sisters, to our Kurdish brothers and sisters. We see you. We will not abandon you. Never again. I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized. Mr. Smith.
I just yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
I want to thank my good friend and colleague, Mr. Hoyer, for his comments. We did travel so many times to the Soviet Union, the East Bloc countries, and to Turkey, and raised human rights issues methodically, persistently. But this issue has always been one of those unresolved, festering sores that if we could get it right, and this House going on record, I think, is the beginning of that process. So I want to thank him for his leadership over these years and his friendship, and above all, for that very eloquent statement. I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 5 minutes to the author of this important resolution, the Vice Chair of the Congressional Armenian Caucus, Chair of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.Res. 296, which I introduced along with Representative Bill Rackus to recognize and commemorate the Armenian Genocide. This is a vote that I have fought for 19 years to cast. My wonderful colleagues, Anna Eshu, Jackie Spear, have fought far longer than I have. It is one that tens of thousands of my constituents, my Armenian American constituents, have waited decades to see. It is a moment that so many have worked and struggled and prayed for, a moment when the House of Representatives refused to be enlisted in the cause of genocide denial. This April would have marked the 104th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, the systematic murder of 1.5 million Armenians and the displacement of millions more by the Ottoman Empire from 1915 to 1923. Many other religious and ethnic minorities in the Ottoman Empire met similar fates, among them the Greeks, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, and others. More than a century later, it is our solemn responsibility to remember those who were lost, to seek justice and restitution, and to educate Americans and those around the world about the crime of genocide. The facts of the genocide are horrific and undisputed by historians. They were recorded by American diplomats serving in the Ottoman Empire at the time, who bore witness in official cables to the annihilation of the Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire, a crime that at the time had no name. And though it lacked a name, there was no doubt in the observers of the time that they were witnessing a crime on a massive and industrial scale. The U.S. ambassador of the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau, would recall later, "I am confident that the whole history of the human race contains no such horrific, horrible episode as this. The great massacres and persecutions of the past seem almost insignificant when compared with the suffering of the Armenian race in 1915. It was only decades later that Raphael Lemkin, a Holocaust survivor, coined the term genocide to describe the atrocities that had been visited upon the Jews as well as the Armenians. I have sat with survivors of the genocide, men and women, their numbers dwindling year after year, and heard them recall the destruction of their lives and the loss of all they had known. As children, they were forced from their homes and saw their families beaten, raped, and murdered. They fled across continents and oceans to build lives in this nation, in Armenia, and around the world. For them and for their descendants, the word genocide is sacred because it means that the world has not and will not forget. To deny genocide, on the other hand, is profane. It is, in the words of Elie Wiesel, a double killing. Mr. Speaker, it is always the right time to recognize genocide, but it is particularly so today. For when we see the images of terrified Kurdish families in northern Syria, loading their possessions into cars or carts, and fleeing their homes headed to nowhere except away from Turkish bombs and marauding militias, how can we truly say the crimes of a century ago are in the past? We cannot. We cannot pick and choose which crimes against humanity are convenient to speak about. We cannot cloak our support of human rights in euphemisms. We cannot be cowed into silence by a foreign power. But what we can do, what we must do, Mr. Speaker, is state the facts. We can say that the Ottoman Empire committed this grotesque crime against the Armenians. But their campaign of extermination failed. And above all, we will never forget. And we will never again be silenced. I'm grateful, Mr. Engel, for your leadership, and that of Mr. McCall, and that of the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilrakis, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith. To so many members on both sides of the aisle who have fought for recognition for decades, I urge every member of the House to join today in supporting HRES 296, and I yield back.
Gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, we reserve the balance of our time.
Reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
I yield 3 minutes to an important leader on these issues for many, many years, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, first I would like to pay tribute to the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Engel, for helping to bring this to the floor, to everyone that is part of, from both sides of the aisle, of the Armenian caucus in the House, to my sister, friend, Congresswoman Jackie Spear, who shares this heritage with me. I rise in strong support of this resolution, House Resolution 296, which affirms the Armenian genocide. This is an historic day in the House of Representatives, and it's one that I've been waiting for 27 years. Between 1915 and 1923, 1.5 million Armenians and hundreds of thousands, and this is a historical fact that many people are not aware of, that there were hundreds of thousands of Assyrians, Greeks, Arameans, Maronites, and other Christians that were systematically slaughtered by the Ottoman Empire. This is deeply personal for me. I'm the only member of Congress of Armenian Assyrian descent and one of only 3 of with Armenian heritage in the House of Representatives, I think in the entire Congress, Senate and House. Some of you know that, that I had members of my own family that were among those that perished, and my parents fled with theirs to America. As my father said, the best idea that was ever born was America. What all of those that were persecuted had in common was that they were Christians, and that's why they were hunted down and slaughtered. This resolution not only honors my ancestors, but all those who perished in the first genocide of the 20th century. The United States has been missing in action on the honor roll of over 24 countries, 14 of which are NATO allies, and 49 states in our country that have formally recognized the Armenian genocide. And today we can end over 100 years of silence by passing this resolution. Mr. Speaker, there's also an historic parallel as we are considering this resolution, and that is that Turkey is pursuing the ethnic cleansing of Kurds in Syria as we meet today. As Pope Francis declared when he visited the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Yerevan in 2016, memory should never be watered down or forgotten. Memory is the source of peace in the future. So today we remember, and we say to all those who perished, we remember, we love you, and we set an example for the young people of our country that the moral authority of the United States is well and alive. As we pass this resolution, I yield back.
Gentlewoman from California yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from New York is reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I just want to thank Anna Eshoo for her, I yield myself 30 seconds, for her leadership throughout many decades on this issue. It was her idea to bring it up on the floor today, and I want to thank her for that. Of course, she had to work within the leadership to get it done, but thank you for recommending that. And I want to remind members that in 2018, Anna Eshoo and I wrote the Iraq and Syria Genocide Relief and Accountability Act. It was signed by President Trump into law, and that provided two things: humanitarian relief for the tens of thousands of Christians and Yazidis fleeing from ISIS, and also it provided an accountability piece to collect for hopefully utilization in a future court cases against the perpetrators of these heinous crimes. So I want to thank her for that work that we did together, but again, for her leadership on this issue.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York is recognized. Mr. Engel.
I yield 1 minute to the acting chairwoman of the Committee on Oversight and Reform, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney.
Gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Malone, is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his leadership on the committee and for this resolution, and to Anna Eshoo and Chairman Schiff and so many of my friends and colleagues for their long efforts to pass it on both sides of the aisle. As a member of the Congressional Caucus on Armenian Issues and the representative of a large and vibrant Armenian community in New York City, I strongly support H.R. 296, affirming the United States record on the Armenian genocide. 104 years ago, 1.5 million Armenians were murdered by the Ottoman Empire in the first genocide of the 20th century. Ever since, Armenian communities from across the world, including those in my district, have been forced to fight for recognition and justice, of denial in so many ways, from the illegal invasion of Cyprus by Turkey to the vicious attacks on Kurds within and without of the borders of Turkey. With our vote today, the United States takes a long overdue step to stop Turkey from hiding the truth of its actions. The Armenian genocide must be acknowledged by all, and in doing so, we can hope to prevent the next genocide. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlewoman from New York yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, we reserve.
Reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
I now yield 3 minutes to the co-chair of the Congressional Armenian Caucus, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spear.
Ms. Spear, the gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank the Speaker. Thank you, Chairman Engel, Chairman McCall, and to Mr. Smith, and a deep sense of gratitude to Congressman Schiff for introducing H.R. 296, and to my sister, my Armenian sister, Congresswoman Eshoo, for helping us plot this strategy to get this bill to the floor. April 24th, 1915 is a day that lives in infamy in the hearts and minds of millions of Armenians worldwide. It's a day that I grew up understanding from my Armenian mother to be one of the darkest in history. It's the day that the Ottoman government embarked on a systematic slaughter of 1.5 million Armenians, 2/3 of the Armenian population. This genocide is recognized in countries around the world, including Canada, France, and Germany. It's recognized in 49 states in our union as the first genocide of the 20th century. Yet the House of Representatives hasn't recognized both the genocide occurred and that the Ottoman Empire perpetrated it. Elie Wiesel called it denying genocide, and in particular the Armenian genocide, a double killing, because it not only exterminates a group of people, it murders the memory of that crime. Congress must ensure that memory is not destroyed and those lives are honored. As a child, I listened to my mom speak of the atrocity with pain and fear. She is gone now, but her pain lives on in me to this very day. By righting this terrible wrong, one that has festered for far too long, we are alleviating that pain and sending a message that history can't be rewritten. We are stating in no uncertain terms that America will no longer abandon Armenians with feeble excuses made for
the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire genocidal campaign from 1915 to 1923 killed 1.5 million Armenians, men and women and children, as well as Greeks, Assyrians, Chaldeans, and Syriacs throughout a series of executions and death marches. Finally, today we are entering into the United States record the Armenian Genocide and the historical fact. Today we end a century of international silence. There will not be another period of indifference or international ignorance to the lives lost to systematic murder. Genocides, wherever and whenever they occur, cannot be ignored, whether they took place in the 20th century by the Ottoman Turks or mid-20th century by the Third Reich and in Darfur. Genocide must be acknowledged for what it is, a scourge on the human race. Genocide is genocide, Mr. Speaker, even if our so-called strategic allies perpetrate it. President Ronald Reagan explicitly refer to the Ottoman Empire's actions as the genocide of the Armenians in a 1981 Holocaust Remembrance Day speech. And over 30 nations have formally recognized the genocide, including France, Germany, and even Russia. Today, Mr. Speaker, the United States is going to acknowledge it as well. I found Pope Francis's words and explicit use of the term genocide to be another wake-up call for the world. We must acknowledge the atrocities of the past so that we might hopefully prevent them in the future. Our darkest moments as a human race have come during times when those who knew better stood silently, making excuses for passivity and allowing injustice and persecution to reign. Turkey's current actions in northern Syria against our Kurdish allies is extremely concerning. And we cannot stand by and let egregious human rights violations happen. Turkey's offensive into Syria is unacceptable behavior from a U.S. ally and so-called secular democracy, as well as a NATO member. It's simply deplorable, Mr. Speaker. We also need to make sure that other genocidal campaigns being waged in the Middle East are also properly recognized. ISIS is a perpetrator of genocide. Christians and other minorities are being killed solely because of their religion. And no modern society should sit silently in the face of such barbaric brutality. Again, I'm thankful we are finally recognizing these atrocities and these acts against the Armenian people. Like the earliest Christians, the Armenians proved themselves not only survivors of persecution, but also masters of their destinies. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Florida yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, and Non-Proliferation on our Foreign Affairs Committee. He's been a leader on this issue for years. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, 2 minutes.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for 2 minutes.
American honor demands that we end our complicity in genocide denial. 4 arguments are made against this resolution. The first is that it's not true. No one can even make that argument anymore. 1.5 million Armenians and countless Assyrians, Greeks, and others massacred by the Ottoman government. Second, they argue that Turkey's such a great ally that we should turn a blind eye to what happened last century. Earlier this month, Turkish forces shelled both to the left and the right of American military bases. American soldiers fled in unseemly haste. Great ally Turkey is. Then we're told, well, the Foreign Affairs Committee hasn't had hearings. We've had countless hearings on this for decades, including also a 4-hour markup where we passed it through the committee. And the only argument made on the other side there was Turkey was such a great ally. Well, last week we had hearings in our committee that demonstrate that Turkey is not such a great ally of the United States. And finally, we're told, and this was insulting, I think, during the rules debate, someone arguing against the rules said it's not worth our time. 1.5 million dead. The fact is that genocide denial is the last act of a genocide. First you obliterate a people, then you obliterate their memory, and finally you seek to obliterate the memory of the obliteration. And also, genocide denial is the first step in the next genocide. When Hitler's cadres wondered whether they could get away with the Holocaust, he was able to reassure them by saying, "Who today speaks of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Denying genocide in the past will lead to more genocides in the future. Today, Germany is a great and prosperous democracy because it has come to grips with its own past. Where would Germany be today if it denied the Holocaust? Turkey will become a prosperous and a modern nation only when it recognizes the first genocide of the 20th century. The best thing we could do for Turkey is to acknowledge the genocide and urge them to do likewise. I yield back.
I could yield an additional minute to my colleague.
Gentleman.
You asked for a minute.
I thank the gentleman from...
Time right now? Gentleman from New York, do you yield any time or his time has expired?
I reserve.
Mr. Speaker, the gentleman asked me if he had...
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized, and gentleman from New Jersey
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
yields 1 minute.
A minute and a half
to the gentleman. Gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, has 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and this is indeed a bipartisan speech. The fact is, many other countries have recognized this genocide, and they've done so under tremendous Turkish pressure. For example, France was told that they would not be able to export to Turkey if they recognized the genocide. They did, and in the subsequent 6 years, French exports to Turkey quadrupled. This genocide has been recognized by Argentina, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the list goes on and on. It is time for America to also recognize the truth. And so I look forward to the day, which is not true today, when scholars and individuals in Turkey can talk about the genocide, can come to grips with their own past, instead of being threatened with incarceration for even mentioning this debate. Because Turkey will not have the rule of law and democracy until you're free to discuss the first genocide of the 20th century on Turkish soil. I yield back.
Jim yields back balance of time. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves.
Mr. Speaker, we reserve the balance for time.
Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to a valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Chair, I rise in support of H.Res. 296, a resolution introduced by my friend Mr. Schiff to recognize the horror of the genocide perpetuated against the Armenian people by the Ottoman Empire between 1913 and 1925, killing 1.5 million martyrs. There is no question that the Ottoman Empire carried out a systemic campaign of persecution, forced removal, starvation, and murder against Armenians, along with other Christian minorities living under Ottoman rule. This campaign was documented in real time by American diplomats and has been acknowledged in various forms by previous administrations and Congresses, the last in 1984. In order to prevent future genocides and mass atrocities, it's vital that we never forget those who have already occurred. For too long, we've allowed foreign interests to lobby the United States in favor of turning the other way and not wholly recognizing the truth of the Armenian genocide. That ends today. In Rhode Island, we have a very proud Armenian community that have demonstrated extraordinary resilience. They deserve for Congress to acknowledge the history of their people and the truth of the Armenian genocide. That will happen today. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back balance of time. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
Thank you, sir. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, another wonderful member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Costa.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Costa, is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to support House Resolution 296, which would establish the permanent United States recognition and the ongoing remembrance of the Armenian genocide. And I want to thank Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall and Mr. Smith and all of the supporters of this resolution. In 1915, the Ottoman Empire, as we all know, embarked upon a systematic deportation and murder of 1.5 million Armenians. These innocent men and women and children became the first genocide as we know. $110 co-sponsors in supporting this long overdue passage by the United States House of Representatives. Mr. Speaker, the horrors of the Armenian genocide can never, ever, ever be undone. Yet by acknowledging the suffering of these victims through the official recognition of the Armenian genocide, we can ensure that at least future generations will never forget. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chairman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel is recognized.
It's now my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, another respected member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Liu.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Liu is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Engel and Congressman Smith, for your leadership. The United States of America should never be afraid to tell the truth. And yet, for too long, we did not recognize the Armenian genocide. That ends today. The House of Representatives is going to formally recognize the Armenian genocide. Over a century ago, the Ottoman Empire began a plan to systematically exterminate Armenians from their land. 1.5 million Armenians were killed across the Turkish countryside. No amount of revisionist history or lobbying can change those facts. Today is a historic day. Today, we tell the truth and we honor the Armenian genocide. I yield back.
Gentleman, California yields back his time. The gentleman from New York reserves his time. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Speaker, we reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel is recognized.
It's now my honor to yield 1 minute to our Speaker of the House, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Pelosi.
Gentleman from California, Ms. Pelosi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and more importantly, I thank him for bringing this very important legislation to the floor today. And thank you, Mr. Smith, for your ongoing commitment to justice in the world in terms of respecting the dignity and worth of people and not ignoring atrocities when they happen now and long time ago. It's a pleasure to work with you always. And Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you. We have tried and gotten this bill out of committee more than one time, and now it has come to the floor. It's an honor to speak on it, and it's a great day for the Congress that we have that privilege. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Speaker, I rise to join my colleagues in solemn remembrance of one of the great atrocities of the 20th century, the systematic murder of more than 1.5 million Armenian men, women, and children by the Ottoman Empire. Too often, tragically, the truth of this staggering crime has been denied. Today, let us clearly state the facts on the floor of this House to be etched forever into the congressional record. The barbarism committed against the Armenian people was a genocide. As international observers wrote at the time, it was a campaign of race extermination, one that we as members of Congress and as freedom-loving people have a moral obligation to never forget. If we ignore history, then we are destined to witness the mistakes of the past be repeated. The recent attacks by the Turkish military against the Kurdish people are a stark and brutal reminder of the danger in our own time. That is why it is critical year in and year out to reaffirm our dedication to recognizing the Armenian genocide and to placing the U.S. Congress firmly on the side of honesty in our histories and for that I thank Chairman Schiff, Chairman Engel, Congresswoman Eshoo, Armenian co-chairs Pallone and Spear, and all who have worked relentlessly on this critical resolution, which states that Democrats and Republicans join to commemorate the Armenian Genocide through official recognition and remembrance, to reject efforts to enlist, engage, or otherwise associate the United States government with denial of the Armenian Genocide or any other genocide, and third, encourage education and public understanding of the facts of the Armenian Genocide, including the United States' role in humanitarian relief efforts and the relevance of the Armenian Genocide to modern-day crimes against humanity. To honor the memory of those lost and the suffering of those who survived, we firmly and unequivocally denounce all attempts to devalue or minimize these heinous crimes. I urge a strong vote for this resolution, which is a statement of America's commitment to human rights and to the truth. We are blessed in our country with a large Armenian American population, some serving, Congresswoman Spiro, Congresswoman Eshoo, and others in this House. And every year we come together to observe the sadness of the genocide. But today, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Smith, today we have the opportunity, and may we have the strength and courage to always denounce hate, violence, and bigotry, to right the wrongs of history, and to build a future of hope, peace, and freedom for all mankind. That is who we are as Americans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and others, for giving us the opportunity to state our values. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chairwoman from California yields back the balance of her time. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
We reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the co-chair of the Congressional Armenian Caucus, the gentleman from New Jersey who has for many, many years been at the forefront of championing this very important resolution. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank Mr. Engel for all his work on this. And I have to, of course, thank all the members of the Armenian Caucus. One of the reasons that we founded the Armenian Caucus was the recognition of the Armenian Genocide. But I also have to mention that, as I think everyone knows, without Speaker Pelosi, this would never have come to the floor today. It's ultimately her decision to bring it to the floor, and I just want to thank her immensely. Official recognition of the Armenian Genocide is a powerful reminder that we will not turn away when we know full well that crimes against humanity have been perpetrated. We stand here today to pay tribute to the victims of this horrific chapter of history, to the perseverance of those who survived, and to the Americans of Armenian descent who continue to strengthen our country. It's our duty to honor that history with an honest, factual statement recognizing the massacre of 1.5 million Armenians as the 20th century's first genocide. This resolution cannot undo the horrors of the victims endured or the pain that their descendants carry with them, but we have an obligation to speak candidly about the past that is directly tied to our moral responsibilities of the present. The United States must never accept crimes against humanity, and we must do everything in our power to prevent and stop atrocities unfolding in real time. What is currently taking place in Syria, the killing of the Kurds at the hands of the Turkish President Erdogan, is unacceptable. And it is far past time for the Turkish government to accept its responsibility for systematic extermination of Armenians in the past century and to commit to protect the dignity of every human life in this century. I encourage my colleagues to join in supporting this long overdue recognition of the Armenian genocide. Your vote is not only for the Armenians, but to prevent genocide in the future. And let us note that the Ottoman Turks did not succeed. Their Armenians are still here in the United States, in